All right, well, I can hear, so if you all have something to say at home, I'm gonna have to say it to them because it's coming through my computer, but nowhere else, so. Okay, to begin today, in our study of Luke and the parables, of course, you know that whenever we're studying Luke, I want to start with Exodus chapter 2.
Of course.
So let me do a share screen here while we find Exodus chapter 2. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Okay. Exodus chapter 2, and we will start with verse 11 and see if this story rings a bell for you. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, and he saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting. And he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" And he answered, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" That's a key line. "Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." And when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. So Moses fled from Pharaoh. All right, the key line for us today is going to be, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" If you read further in Exodus, after Moses leads the people out of Israel, he is indeed ruler and judge. And the people come to him for these kinds of things. But at that time, he did not have that role. And we're gonna see how there's a contrast with that when we look at today's passage. I also want to point out that in our scriptures, if people look at this and say, how can you follow this religion? Look at how violent all of this stuff is, and look at how terrible these people are. Why does Moses have any credibility? Look what he did. Why would David have any credibility? Look what he did with Bathsheba and Uriah. What? And I think, you know what? That's humanity. And if God had any perfect humans to deal with, I'm sure he would choose them. But since there aren't any, and so what we do is we don't sweep it under the rug. I say, if we're going to have honesty, we tell the stories, and all of this is at least known. And we have known people who have had things that they've done, issues in their life, things that they regret, whatever. And yet we've known that there's redemption, there's a possibility of God using flawed people, there's all kinds of things. So when for example, the iconoclasm today of our country, Thomas Jefferson is so controversial. Well, he had slaves and he fathered illegitimate children with his slaves. So how can we celebrate Thomas Jefferson? Take down all the statues and this Declaration of Independence is great. He was a flawed human, but it didn't mean that he couldn't pass along something good. And for me, I've always thought I'm kind of a snob when it comes to doctors in one way. And one was a counselor, but even, it doesn't matter, psychiatrist. I went to the psychiatrist, I walked into his office and he was crushing out a cigarette, putting it in a Coke can and putting it in. I grew up with a smoking household and I hated it. And so to me, any doctor that isn't smart enough not to smoke is not good enough for me. Well, sometime in my life, I thought, you know what? I had an appendectomy once. What if the only surgeon available was a smoker? Would I say, nope, sorry, you're not smart enough to? No, sometimes a smoking surgeon is going to be what you need. So I'm sorry, Thomas Jefferson. I'm sorry, for Moses, and I'm sorry for David, and I'm sorry for Pastor Jim. I might baptize somebody, I might marry somebody, And if you say, well, this is only valid if Pastor Jim has no skeletons in his closet, it's not possible. So we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think. Anyway, that's my soapbox that I came across on this. So.
Hopefully surgeon isn't smoking while doing your.
Yeah, well, and if he's smoking while doing the appendectomy, I'm still probably going to let him go ahead and do it.
As long as they're not eating illegal at the time.
Yes. So now, here's a Hebrew word that is a fun concept. It's an important concept, and it's one we have some difficulty with that Ken is going to point out. You don't have to know Hebrew or even memorize this, but I want to at least introduce you to the Hebrew word nephesh. Because as Ken will say, we are inheritors of the Greco-Roman tradition, which has big differences from the Hebrew Bible tradition. So we inherit both, but because we are raised in a way that the Greco-Roman tradition has such a sway over us, sometimes it makes it difficult for us to translate between the two. So in the Greco-Roman tradition, and this is going to be just a summary, which won't be nuanced at all. So please know that there's lots of nuance to this, but in their philosophy, the Greeks looked at, you have a body in which is placed a soul. That's Greek. And you might think, yeah, well, that doesn't sound too radical to me. So that we have a body and then a soul is placed within that. But in much of the Greek tradition, the way that comes about then is that because matter is impermanent, matter is tainted in many ways, matter is not of God. A lot of people think God is spirit, that somehow the body is looked at as a prison for the eternal, the permanent, the more pure soul. And that life is basically about escaping or being released from this prison of matter. Now, again, this is a gross summary, so there's a lot of nuance to that, and not everybody thinks that way, but I know that comes out and came out at Jesus' time and later in the form of Gnosticism. And there were groups called Gnostics, and Gnostics means knowledge. They thought that it was secret knowledge, and part of that was the secret knowledge that the soul is pure, the body is evil, and there were certain sects that would only eat cucumbers because those were supposedly going to be the least impure thing. And you'd become ascetic, which means you deny the flesh. Asceticism is to deny the flesh. Well, we know that that's not all bad. Fasting can be a very good thing. As a discipline, it can be healthy, but it can also be taken overboard. And if you do it because all matter is evil, and I can't enjoy food because that's, or I can't enjoy anything physical because I'm trying to get, what do we say in the Apostles' Creed? I believe in the resurrection of the body. I can't explain it, but it is a way of saying, no, we are not simply a prison body with a pure soul imprisoned within. We are body, soul, spirit, a unity. It's all one. And that is where we come to the Hebrew concept, which is not the Greek concept at all, called nephesh. So I'm going to try and describe to you a little bit about that.
How do you spell that, sir, or is it up there?
Well, if you're going to try the English spelling, a way to do it would be on the last word on the screen here, Nephesh, E-S-H. That's how it's pronounced as far as I know. So this is a concept that helps us to begin to understand the contrast. The word nephesh refers to aspects of sentience. We talk about sentient beings. And the primary meaning of the term nephesh is the breath of life in the nostrils of all living beings. And by extension, life, person, or very self. So those are ways you could do that. And it's important to know that English has no corresponding term. So we don't have anything to correspond to that. The very first 4 times nephesh is used in the Bible is for animals. In English, he put in the definition Christian, soul, all right, we use the word soul. It has quite different connotations, but that's as close as we get in English. So it's oftentimes used to translate nephesh, even though it doesn't get the whole concept. In Genesis 2:7, the text is not that Adam was given a nephesh, a soul was implanted in Adam. It said that Adam became a nephesh. So that was, nephesh was used as sentience for animals that live and breathe. And Adam then was also described as nephesh, not having a nephesh. Because in English, we'd say, yeah, now he has a soul. He's been given a soul. No, he is a soul. That's an important distinction. Also, if you want to know, other living things, bugs and plants, were not considered nephesh in the Bible. So interesting how they approached it. Nephesh, when put with another word in Hebrew, can detail aspects related to the concept of nephesh, being, with, for example, the word ruach, which is breath, wind, or spirit. So, and this describes a part of humankind that is immaterial, not matter. So we have nephesh, which is a unified body and, for lack of a better term, soul, a nephesh, which includes matter. But then we have ruach, which is breath, wind, spirit, immaterial. It's not matter.
So,
When those,
warm-blooded has a nephesh and cold-blooded basically not?
no, I think alligators are nephesh. Yeah, I don't think it's warm-blooded and cold-blooded. I think it's, and I don't know the full distinctions because I'm wondering about fish. I don't know. I'm not sure how the Bible.
Our pets, definitely.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. So, and I'm guessing fish too, and birds for sure, but not bugs and plants. So, in the Hebrew mindset. So yeah, it's very different. And we think to Native American things, they probably would relate to this much easier than we would, at least at first. So there's a material, nephesh, which includes what we think of soul, that isn't given, but just is. And then there's the ruach, which is the spirit. And how did, after Adam was described as being formed of the clay, what animated him? When God breathed into his nostrils, breath. Yes, the breath of life. So together, ruach nephesh is this body, soul, and spirit. Things that are immaterial are included in ruach, not just breath. How about emotions? Will. These are all immaterial. Intellect. Some of us have some. Oh, come on, people.
Some of us are seeking. Yes, some of us are seeking.
Personality, conscience, all of these immaterial things could be described. Now we are sentient beings, but with the ruach, which is different perhaps than the animals. I think that's the distinction. Although they have aspects of emotion, will, I'm not sure, personality. I don't know the full distinction.
Does the ruach have to have a visual body? Like in Indiana Jones, the ark? Remember when they opened it up and it had ruach?
I will say no with trepidation because I'm not that scholarly and smart, but for example, when the Spirit hovered over the waters in creation, God, Father, Son, Spirit, or Word, Creator, Word, Spirit, the Spirit hovered over the waters. It's ruach. So, and it's not an embodied matter that we at least know of. So I'm going to say no, but that you'll probably have to ask Renee to do some research and give you a report on that.
Like the Holy Spirit, right?
Yes. Okay, so in Job chapter 11, for example, these two words are used together and juxtaposed in a parallel, which means they're not quite the same, but they have a relation to each other. Job says, therefore, I will not refrain my mouth. Remember when we studied Job, his friends are saying, shut up, confess your sin. And he says, I will not refrain from complaining. I will speak the anguish of my ruach, my spirit, my emotions, my conscience, my will. And then in parallel, it says, I will complain in the bitterness of my nephesh. And we translate it soul. But again, there's no English word for being. It just doesn't fully come across. All right. What I'm trying to do here, other than confuse Larry and to look smart, is prepare us for some of the things that Ken is going to talk about. So in the Hebrew, and this might be, I may have already touched on this, in the Hebrew Bible, human beings and other animals are both being described as being nephesh. Bugs and plants, examples of live organisms that are not referred to as nephesh. Now, we're going to go to the New Testament Greek. How do they translate ruach? How do they translate the word breath, spirit, wind? In Greek, the word is psyche, from which we get psyche. And that's the closest equivalent to the Hebrew nephesh. So again, to translate Hebrew even into Greek, it's not perfect. It doesn't get the whole concept. In its turn, then Latin, after psyche, the Latin word is anima. And I love the word edamon. I had to look that one up, Jim, which means the derivative source. Suke or psyche became anima in Latin, which is the derivative or the source of the word animal in English. So, or animate, or those kinds of things.
Yeah.
No, Nancy.
It's all a matter of pronunciation.
I won't tell you what Renee said. You'll have to ask Patty later. So now I'm going to turn to a book from the Apocrypha, which are, I believe, the 14 books that the Catholic Bible has as canon. The Protestant Bible says, hey, these are really good history books, and they tell us a lot about the period, but they're not quite the inspired books of the Old Testament and the New Testament. These were written in between. And there's a book called Sirach, which is also known as Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes. So in Ecclesiasticus 11, 18 and 19, and this is on your sheets somewhere if you want to look. I don't remember what page. But this is just to tell you, before we read our story today, there are precursor stories. And that's common. So when Jesus the rabbi comes around, he's taking stories they know and giving his own variation and theme. So here's an older story about 178 BC, written in Ecclesiasticus by Sirach ben Jesus, son of Jesus. So that name was also common. Not the Jesus of Nazareth. A man grows rich by his sharpness and grabbing. So we already know that this is kind of a aggressive kind of a person. And here is the reward for what he receives for it. He says, I have found rest, and now I can enjoy my goods. But he does not know how long this will last. He will have to leave his goods for others and die. So it's a little wisdom saying. And we can get enough out of that to say, yeah, we see the truth of that. You know, they're trying to say life does not consist in possessions. And sometimes humans can get caught up in living for possessions in a way that takes away the true meaning of life. So this is a wisdom saying for that. The only reason Ken brings this up is to say there are precursor stories for what we're going to get today. And so we can have a little contrast for how Jesus might use those concepts. Now we're going to go to a book in the pseudepigrapha, which literally means falsely attributed. We don't know, it says the Gospel of Thomas, but they say that's false. It's not Thomas who wrote this. That's what pseudepigrapha means. And the Gospel of Thomas is very interesting to read, and it comes from a time period that is very instructive, but we don't hold it as authoritatively inspired scripture. But in there, you'll see it says there's a story. A man said, "Speak to my brothers that they divide my father's possessions with me." Sound familiar? And then he said to him, whoever he was speaking to, presumably a rabbi or Jesus, he said, "Oh man, who made me a divider?" He turned to his disciples and said to them, "I am not a divider, am I?" And forgive me, this is written of Jesus. Jesus said, there was a man, I'm sorry, that's mistyped on the screen. There was a man who had many possessions. He said, I will use my possessions that I may sow and reap and plant and fill my storehouses with fruit so that I may lack nothing. These were the thoughts in his heart, and in that night he died. He who has ears, let him hear. So again, it's a wisdom story. The folly of living life in pursuit of possessions as the end all be all. Okay, now here's another one. And forgive me, but I'm kind of giving you this random background. But as I was watching Ken, I thought, okay, this will be good to have this background expanded a little when Ken gets to it. All right, in the prophet Habakkuk, and this has been for me a very important passage. I remember when I first told you about this, I said, what Indian tribe even do we know about that the settlers and anybody said, oh my goodness, those are you don't want to get captured by or confront them. They're all Apache. Yeah. Why do we even know that? It's a legend or it's a whatever that's been handed down that even we know that there were certain tribes that could be looked at with different characteristics, but the Apache were apparently terribly to be feared. I don't know much beyond that. And I'm not trying to make any comment about that. I'm just saying this is a fact of what we've had handed down to us, that certain peoples can be at least characterized, whether fairly or not. And here's what Habakkuk said about the Chaldeans, which, if I understand correctly, ended up being the Babylonians. And in a threat to God's own people, Habakkuk was prophesying. God says, I am rousing the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous nation who march through the breadth of the earth, seizing dwellings not their own. And this line, well, I'll never forget it. Dread and fearsome are they. So Apaches squared. Why? For their justice and dignity proceed from themselves. So what they do and what they think is right has no objective authority or outside authority. It comes from themselves. So this is the way we think justice is, and so we're going to enact it, whatever. And we find people sometimes falling into that today. Their justice and dignity proceeds from themselves. In fact, I'm afraid secular America, having given up on God, we think our justice and dignity proceed from human things. And I think that's disastrous. And so that's how the Chaldeans were described. And I forgot to bring my plumb bob in, but remember Amos 7:7, who talked about God's people shall not be so. When they go astray, as they did in Amos' words, he says, this is what he showed me. The Lord was standing beside the wall with a plumb bob or a plumb line in his hand. You all know a plumb line? And the Lord said, Amos, what do you see? A plumb line. And then the Lord said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people, Israel. All right, so God's people, and this says Israel, I'm going to say we follow in those footsteps. Justice and righteousness does not proceed from what I think, my being, my inner. I have to compare myself to a plumb line, just like if I'm building a wall and want to get it vertical, I have to use a plumb line. I can't eyeball it. And so we can't eyeball justice. We have our God as our standard. Jesus is the ultimate plumb line. So if I think, it's important for me to next week, I need to weed out the church, and I've got to pick out which ones I'm going to sacrifice and which ones I'm going to keep, because I have this notion that this is what's right, and we can't keep going on like this, and so I've got to take over and do it. Thank God, you now have the Word of God, the Spirit, Scripture as it witnesses to the Word of God. You have the history of the church's interpretation. You have the current church who will say, wait a minute, Pastor Jim, I think this is proceeding from you. This doesn't seem to be in plumb with the standard that we're trying to live to. So you see how we can't just go off on our own and say, okay, now I've got it, I'll take it from here. Who needs the Bible? Who needs the Spirit? Who needs the church? It's disastrous. You become the Chaldeans when you do that. And they thought they were doing marvelous things for the world. Most of the the movies, the big Marvel series, if any of you watched it here, it all culminated with this super powerful Thanos, whose whole goal was to bring peace to the world by having the power to snap his fingers and wipe out half the population as he saw fit, because and he said that's a small price to pay for the peace that will come. And I think that follows this theme. We could get to that point where we will decide who lives and dies and how things should go forward. And if all we need is the power, whatever power that is, all we need is the power, and we'll snap our fingers and get things in order. And when we start to go there, it's disaster. Okay, you can take a breath because I'm done pontificating for the moment. Okay, so I'm going to go to Ken here shortly. After we read, I would like to read our passage. It's Luke chapter 12. It's going to be page 15 on your handouts if you have them. I will share that with the group at home here. I'll try to make it as large as I can. Hopefully you can see that. So here we go with our story of the rich fool, of which, again, the parable is not right at the very beginning, it's contained. So one of the multitude, so now we have an audience, said to him, "Teacher, bid my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now we see that there are precursor stories to this. We've been over a couple of them. But Jesus said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or divider over you?" That was in the Gospel of Thomas. All right. Remember, in the story of Exodus, it was not Moses, but it was the person he was trying to judge and say, "Who made you a judge or divider over us?" All right. So now this is a contrast. And then he said to them, "Take heed," this is a wisdom saying, "take heed and beware of all covetousness," or covetousness, actually is how Ken says it. "For a man's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Here's a wisdom saying that was very common and expressed in a lot of these different ways that we looked over, plus a lot more. And then he told this parable, saying, "There was a certain rich man whose land brought forth plenty. And he discussed with himself, saying, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger barns, and then I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And what have you prepared? Whose will these things be?' And then another wisdom saying, 'So is he who lays up treasures for himself and is not enriching towards God.'" All right. Okay, I'm going to get ready to go to Ken, and I'm going to pray that we can hear Ken. But is there any comment or question before we move into that? You're chomping at the bit. I love it. Here we go. I'll play some of the fantastic music, hopefully.
We're happy to have you with us again today, Christian friends, as we continue our discussion and study of Jesus as a metaphorical theologian. You know, those of us who are in the Western world and are thereby the inheritors of the Greco-Roman heritage and mindset have a very special problem. And that problem is the fact that from the Greek heritage, going clear back to the 5th century BC with the great classical age of Greece, there is a tendency to make this division between the body and the soul, where the Greeks said, yes, you have a body and you have a soul, and the soul is placed in this body, and the body is somehow some kind of a prison. And so the intellectual life, the spiritual life, is to attempt to try and, as much as possible, set that body aside, ignore it, separate yourself from it, because it's the source of evil in life. And so the goal of spirituality is to have nothing to do with the body. And this sort of dichotomy of the division between body and soul continues to feed into the spirituality of the Christian church and has all across the centuries. But properly understood, the New Testament does not find its intellectual roots in Greek classicism, but in the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, there is no such dichotomy between body and spirit. Indeed, there, body and spirit come together in a unity which is called the nephesh, which cognates with the Arabic nefs, which is a word which we still use very commonly in the Middle East. And this means your whole person. And your whole person is total fusion of body and soul. And so thereby, for Paul, it's impossible to talk about the resurrection without including the resurrection of the body, which he, of course, defines as a spiritual body. Nevertheless, there is a body which resurrects. Now, this means, of course, that we cannot talk about a spiritual gospel in isolation from the reality of the physical world in which our souls are placed and in which God in his creation has placed us as human beings. And so there is the constant sort of pressure to somehow make this isolation, but for Jesus, this never happens. When we get the Lord's Prayer, right in the middle of it is the requirement that we should ask for our daily bread, and we ask for it. It is a gift. It comes to us not as something we have earned, but something that comes to us in an unmerited fashion. And so, amazing to find, we discover that Jesus, in fact, has more to say about money than he does about prayer. And whenever he discusses money, it's always in the context of money is something that is not yours. You are a steward over it. And you are responsible for that portion which God has given to you, and you are accountable. But it's not yours. You don't own it. You don't earn something, and after having earned it, have the right to alone decide what is going to happen to that which falls within your power. Granted, the New Testament certainly makes clear that private property is legitimate, and we see this perhaps most clearly in the book of Acts, in which Peter is talking to Ananias and Sapphira and says to them that this was yours and you had the right to do with it as you liked. You didn't have to turn it into the church, but having done so, you shouldn't tell lies about it. So there is there the affirmation of the right to private property. But even that private property is not ours. We are stewards over it in the presence of a God who has given it to us. Now, thereby, we need to look at our Lord's primary parable in which he is discussing some of the aspects of these things. And this is in the great parable of what we have called the rich fool, which has themes going in it that often we fail to appreciate. Let's take a look for a minute at the text. I presume you have the sheet showing the indentations and divisions of the text in your hands before you, and so perhaps you can follow along on the screen, even though all the words may not be clear. Let's look at it for a minute. Jesus was quite willing to be interrupted, and somebody interrupts him and asks him a question. And the question is over the topic of the just division of land. We'll come back and talk about that. And then Jesus answers the initial quest by a rejection. But in fact, the rejection is a call for a new vision. The new vision begins with what we call a wisdom saying. This sort of little nugget of truth could be understood as a kind of a proverb by itself, and the parable ends, look down at the bottom, if you will, with a second wisdom saying of the kind that make up the book of Proverbs. The parable itself then occurs between, in the envelope, if you please, between these two wisdom sayings. And the parable begins with the story of a man whose land brings forth plenty, And the parable ends with all of that, of those goods, all of that plenty is taken from him. And then the action of the story takes place in the middle, in which, first of all, we have one scene in which he enunciates his problem, and then a second scene in which he decides in the present what he is going to do, and then a third scene in which he reflects on the future on the basis of his solution. So problem, solution in the present, and solution in the future are the ways in which these three central themes move within an envelope of God gave it to him, God took it away from him, within an envelope of two wisdom sayings. All of it introduced then by a dialogue on the question of justice. Keeping the sheet in front of you, let us turn now and try to move through this great dialogue and parable and see what our Lord is saying. He begins, as we see, by someone coming to him and saying, "Teacher," and this is the word that Luke uses for rabbi. He doesn't use the Hebrew word, probably because Theophilus, the Greek-speaking person for whom he probably wrote the book, who is mentioned in the first verses, may not know what a rabbi is. So somebody has come to Jesus and said, "Rabbi, you go tell my brother to divide up the inheritance with me." Now, the scene is pretty well clear in that the father has died, there is an estate, the estate is held between two brothers according to the law of the Jews. It could not be divided unless the older brother decided that it should be. So the younger brother, in this case, presumably here, asks that Jesus should go and press his older brother to make the division because he, the younger brother, wants the division. Now, what he's crying out for is justice in the division of land. The division of land is the most sensitive problem that our Middle Eastern world knows anything about. And the cry of justice across our world for the division of land and also for the division of property and many other forms of justice is one of the great cries of the human soul in the 20th century. People all across the world are fighting for one concept of justice or another. Now, we have to be very careful when we look at what Jesus is here saying. He does not oppose this man's cry for justice. But what he does do is he says, look, you have already had a fight with your brother. The relationship between the two of you is already broken. And you have already decided that you are right and he is wrong. And now you are coming to me and saying, okay, Jesus, you go and tell him I'm right and he's wrong and he's got to give me my rights. Now, this fellow does not come to Jesus and say, Jesus, my brother and I have loved each other in the past. There has been a quarrel. We have fought. We are now divided. There is danger lest this division should solidify into a permanent break, and I am concerned. Will you listen to me and listen to him and make reconciliation between us? Perhaps I am mistaken. Perhaps he is mistaken. Perhaps we are both mistaken. No, that isn't what he says. He says, you go tell my brother to give me my rights. Meaning, the division has now happened. It's over. I want mine, and I want to go my way, and I'm right, of course, and he's wrong. Now you pressure him into giving me what I want. Well, there was never anybody who managed to pressure Jesus into giving them what they wanted. If you want to get Jesus upset, why, you just come to him with your own agenda and you try and tweak his nose and get out of him what you think you want, and you're going to be in trouble. So was this man. And Jesus responds and says, man, which in our Middle Eastern speech is a very rough way to talk to people. We still use this phrase, ya rajul, oh man. And this phrase means, I'm not going to use your name and I'm not going to call you friend because I'm not very happy with you. I'll just call you old man. It's a colloquialism and is a very strong. Old man, he says, yeah, who made me a judge and a divider? Is that why I've come? Now, granted, many of the rabbis were experts in law. Basically, a religious person in the first century was a person who made himself into an expert in the law of Moses because that was the central focus of religion for the Jews. And so thereby, the person who can really give you the fine points of the interpretation of the law, these people are the rabbis, and you go to them when you want some help in some legal question. But Jesus says, that's not why I have come. I'm not that type. And granted, some of the rabbis deferred from trying to make these kinds of legal pronouncements. So he says, I have not come as a judge or a divider. Moses, if you remember the story, saw two of his fellow kinsmen fighting, and he tried to enter between them and make a division, and they said, who made you a judge over us? They didn't like it. He wanted to become a divider, and they weren't sure they wanted him. At least those two weren't. Jesus has been asked to be a divider, and he has refused. Now, what's the opposite of a divider? The opposite is obviously a reconciler. And Jesus has come as a reconciler, not a divider. He wants to bring people together and not finalize separations between them. I don't think this means that Jesus is indifferent to the cries of justice. There are too many parables in which he picks up the downtrodden, whether they be the oppressed of society, the outcasts of society, the displaced women of that society, and he picks them up and insists upon them being given their rights. There are too many parables which show his very finely honed concern for social justice in the world in which he lives. This parable gives us the other side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is perhaps as clearly stated as any place I have ever read it in a book by a great missionary theologian of our day, a great world Christian thinker and statesman in the circles of the church by the name of Leslie Newbigin. This man, Scottish of origin, was elected by the Indians as their own bishop in the United Church of South India. And in one of his most recent books, he talks about the theology of mission of our day, and the book is entitled The Open Secret. And in that book, he has one chapter on the question of justice. And he writes as follows: if we acknowledge the God of the Bible, we are committed to struggle for justice in society. Justice means giving to each his due. Our problem, as seen in the light of the gospel, is that each of us overestimates what is due him in compared with what is due to his neighbor. If I do not acknowledge a justice which judges the justice for which I fight, I am an agent, not of justice, but of lawless tyranny. It has been my privilege for the past 27 years to live in the Middle East. And I have seen many communities on many different issues, each of them with an enormous sense of self-righteousness, determined that all they're fighting for is a pure concept of justice. But there is no concept of justice beyond them which judges them, and that thereby they end up fighting not for justice, but for a lawless tyranny. And our world is full of this kind of a lawless tyranny. When the prophet Habakkuk is talking about the coming of the Babylonians, the most awesome thing he can say about them, the most frightening thing to his own soul, is their justice proceeds from themselves. What could be worse? There is no concept of a God of justice who judges them. You see, the difficulty is the person who fights for a just cause thinks that he is thereby a just person. I fight for a good cause. I am a good man. No, that equation doesn't follow. I may be fighting for a good cause, and I may be a ruthless killer. But the fighting for a good cause somehow colors my mind, and I see myself as a great hero for justice, and thereby everything I do in the fighting for that cause, in my eyes, becomes right if I am not judged by a justice that is beyond me. If there is no self-criticism, if there is no turning of the lights on myself to see what is happening to me in the middle of this struggle, then woe to those who fall under the sway of my so-called justice. So within the very keen and very intense and very perceptive awareness of and struggle for justice in human society, which our Lord demonstrates again and again from the very first time he spoke in the very first sermon, in his very first Nazareth in Luke 4. From then on, he is concerned for these things. But here we find the need for a new perspective on ourselves as we cry out for justice. And that's what this parable is about. So, what does he say to this fellow? After he gives him this kind of a sharp rebuke, man, I didn't come to divide people up. He doesn't turn on to a new topic. He's really saying to this fellow, you're sitting there arguing with your brother. And the trouble is, you are sitting here looking at him this way, and he's sitting here looking at you. Now, what you need to do is get up out of your chair and come over here and look at the two of you from a new perspective. If you can do that, there will be created for you the ground, the vision, out of which it will be possible for you to bring about a better solution than the finalizing of the divisions between you. And so he calls upon this man to look at his problem and himself from a new perspective. And so we get the first of these wisdom sayings. What is it? It says, take heed and beware of all covetousness, for a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Or the word covetousness can better be defined, because this is what the Greek word specifically means, as insatiable desires. The problem with material goods is that unless we are somehow delivered from our fear that we will not have enough, one of the basic fears of the human soul, then regardless of how much we get, there is a drive and a pressure within us to get more. There is never quite enough. The sense of security is never fully satisfied. And so all of life is spent in trying to amass more. You know, it's amazing the extent to which the mentality of this penetrates all of our consciousness. I was in a large American city last week and going to a church meeting, and the church meeting happened to be in a wealthy suburb, and so the pastor who was taking me to that meeting said, well, Ken, this church is in one of the nicer sections of the city. And I said, apparently in your mind, Jim, you have equated nice with expensive. And he stopped for a minute and he said, well, yes, of course, that's the way we use the word. And I said to him, Jim, I don't accept the equation. A nice home for me is a simple home that reflects authentically a traditional culture with its values of long extent. I want to find out who these people are and where they have come from. And a one-room, simple peasant home that authentically represents an authentic culture with a long tradition behind it. And the wisdom of that culture is to me a nice home. And the word expensive and the word nice are not necessarily to be put together. And so our problem is the insatiable desires. And so Jesus says, beware of these insatiable desires. A man's life does not consist in the surpluses. And then he goes on to tell a story about a man with surpluses. We could talk a long time about what rights do we have over the surpluses which come to us in the kind of an economic structures within which we find ourselves. And as Christians, we are obliged on the basis of this parable to discuss these things. This goes beyond our time now. I merely point out to you that this wisdom saying is discussing both insatiable desires and the surpluses of material things which come to us, which we do not need. So then he begins the parable. The parable itself is a retelling of an older parable already told by Ben Sirach, a famous philosopher of Jerusalem who wrote about 195 BC. And Jesus has retold it a bit. That story is about a man who, with cunning and with deception and with greed, manages to amass wealth. But this story, no. This is a man, there was a certain rich man. The man already has enough, whose land brought forth plenty. So now he already has enough, and he finally discovers under his power increased wealth, which obviously he can use but doesn't need. And so the question is, what's he going to do with this? And so the next scene we find, it says, and he dialogued with himself. It doesn't say he said to himself. The word is very specific, and in Greek it's dialogue, just like we have it in English. And this is a very sad text. In the Middle East, Middle Eastern peasants always make up their minds about important topics after long discussions with their friends. The villages are very tight-knit. Even in the city of Beirut, I live in an apartment building, and there's an alley right beside us, and our neighbors are about as far away from me as I am from you, as you sit watching your screen. And so we call to one another across the balconies and hang out our wash, and everybody's business is everybody else's. And everything you do in discussion with the people around you. And the slightest decision of life comes after many hours of palaver with your family and your friends. But this man is a man who doesn't seem to have any friends. The increased wealth that has come to him has gradually isolated him from the human family around him, and now when he sits down to palaver with his friends, the only person he can find to talk to is himself. And so the only person out there is he can have a dialogue with himself because the cronies aren't there. It's been amazing to me to notice a phenomena all over the world, from the great houses of Arabia to the palatial summer dwellings of the mountains of Lebanon to Europe and America, that the more wealth people acquire, the farther they withdraw from their neighbors. The larger house they get with the larger ground around it, and they gradually withdraw away from people. I'm not sure I completely understand why, but Isaiah says, woe to you who join house to house and dwell alone in the midst of the land. What an awesome thing, what a frightening thing, what a tragic thing when the warmth of the human family around you is broken by the fact of the accumulation of wealth, which is what has happened to this fellow. And he says, what shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops? He doesn't understand that this is a gift and it's not his, that he is responsible to use it as God would direct him. It's only my crops. And he doesn't think of the fact that he didn't do any more work to produce it this year than last year. This is a bumper crop come to him out of the bounty of God. None of this crosses mine. It's mine, and I'm going to do with it what I like. Ambrose, the famous Latin theologian of the 4th century, says the place to store things like this is in the mouths of the needy. Or Augustine, Ambrose's student of North Africa, says that it's like a man who stores his grain on the ground floor and it gets wet and he needs to store it somewhere else. He'd better move it up to the 2nd floor where it won't get wet and rot. And the 2nd floor is to store your excess wealth in treasures in heaven where moth and rust will not consume. and thieves will not break through and steal. He doesn't see it this way. He says, I will do this. The climax in the middle is the bright idea that he's got. I will pull down my barns and build larger barns and store all my grain and my goods. Now, he's not going to lift a single finger. He's a rich man. He's going to stand there and order other people to do it. But there's no mention of his workers, no mention of his carpenters, no mention of his builders. He talks as though he were, as we would say in Arabic, al-kull fil-kull. He's everything and is going to do everything. So now we've got my crops, my barn, my grain, and my goods. And finally, we get to the end and he says, and I will say to my soul, again, no crumbles. He's all alone. Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Take ease, eat, drink, and relax. And the word here is euphron. It's the word for the diaphragm, and euphron means you got a lot of it, and you, boy, you've made it. You've got $1 million in a numbered Swiss account, and nobody's going to touch you, and you have really made it. And he thinks he's reached the absolute pinnacle of the ease in life, but he is pathetic in his isolation. And then God says to him, you think that with all of this accumulated wealth, that you have reached the position of euphron, of a great extended diaphragm, lots of it, you've made it, and the word for fool that is used is the word aphron. You're without any guts at all. You're without a diaphragm. You are a person who now is completely stupid, having thought that this equation would bring to you the good life. This night, your soul is required back as a loan. You thought all of this stuff was yours. It wasn't. It was on loan. Even your soul was on loan. And you aren't going to take back the loan of your soul, and then we'll see what's going to happen. And the saddest part of all is at the end, in which he says, and who are these things going to be? Everybody's got some family, even Howard Hughes. But this fellow, after the big fight as to who's going to get his wealth, he can't even tell you who's going to win, because he doesn't know. And so the final last word of the results of his life is a great big fight. And at the end of the great big fight, he can't even tell who's going to get the goodies. And so he says at the end is the one treasuring up for himself and not treasuring up for God. I prefer to translate these both as actives. We are to labor that we might offer gifts to God. He doesn't need anything from us, but we are to labor to offer him our gifts. And in that sense, we are treasuring up for God. This young man is called upon to look at the problem of economic justice for which he struggles, not from the point of view of where's mine and how much is his, and let's finalize the quarrel between us, but from the perspective of let us look at who owns all of it, that which is under the authority of my brother and under my authority. And we will discover that it is not mine. It's on loan to both of us. And that we can destroy ourselves by these unsatiable desires. My soul is on loan. My goods are on loan. And I am responsible as a steward before God for both of them. And I yearn that this perspective on material things might be the perspective out of which all of us might act, that we too might seek justice and at the same time look within our souls to perceive and to enunciate and to live out the perspectives of our Lord.
Much upon which to reflect. And you'll have to stop me because I've got so much to say. So please interrupt when you have something. The idea of private property is affirmed, but if we're going to have a justice outside of ourselves, our perspective on our private property that we work for and maintain and earn, and there is a right to that, is that we are stewards of everything. And that's difficult. And I took a class in the church in Kansas by one of the members' spouses there, who became a member, but he was kind of out of place because he grew up in the Quaker tradition. And I said, it must be hard for you on a Sunday to really feel worship. And he said, yeah, it is, because it's just a different kind of tradition. But great respect. He was actually one of our physicians. And he taught a class on the Bible's perspectives on possessions, finances, and wealth. And so a bunch of us went through the class, and it was amazing. And one of the things that we learned about private property, that which is ours, that which is entrusted to us, more like, one of the things that we did that was very meaningful at the time was that we wrote a document. Each individual wrote a document, and it basically was a deed that acknowledged, God, my house is your house that is entrusted to me. So my car, my retirement account, my funds, and we signed a deed for ourselves, but symbolically or more, to say, I am renouncing this idea that somehow this is mine. And I am reaffirming that this is yours entrusted to me. And that's a heady thing to do.
Isn't that like with the Presbyterian churches, isn't the presbytery on the property?
Sure. Yeah, this is interesting. You may give oodles of money and time and elbow grease to fix up the church and keep it nice and so forth. And then in the end, there's a parting. And well, okay, we don't want to be part of the Presbyterian church anymore. We want to be Ethel's church. And they say, okay, well, we're sorry about that. Go find a place. Well, no, we've invested in this place. This is our, no. The church's property is held in trust for the greater denomination. And I grew up understanding that. So, and I tend to be a law keeper in many ways. And so when I saw the great division over sexual issues and so many congregations wanted to leave the denomination because of the positions that were being held, and we want to go and be part of a different denomination or be on our own, and they wanted to take the building with them, and they're not allowed to, and this ended up in the civil courts. It's insane. And to me, it's clear, it's held in trust. You don't own this, I'm sorry, but this is held in trust. You're free to go your own way, but you don't own this. Well, the courts see it differently. And so they're big fights. And so and over the decades, we've had to come up with a peaceful release program. And even the most recent church that was dismissed, they had to negotiate for years as to what kind of a buyout there would be. It's ugly, it's disgusting.
Like divorce.
That's crazy.
It's ugly. So yes, Patty, you're
My
right.
home church did that several years ago, and they ended up, I don't know how much money that they actually paid to the presbytery to buy back the property.
And I don't know who it was.
Did they donate the land, the bricks? Why did they think they should get paid?
Yeah.
The presbytery, that was part of the deal, was that they had to pay off the presbytery in order to buy back the property.
Because they weren't going to be Presbyterians.
Well, there's still, what do they call it? The branch off now?
Well, there's the ECO,
That's what-
Evangelical Covenant Order. There's different Presbyterian branches, but it's a mess. It's an
They're still
absolute mess.
Presbyterian, but they're not.
They're more than-
Yes, they're a different denomination of Presbyterians. There are different divisions. Yeah.
In our doctrines, when we say that we vow to our gifts and our talents,
Mm-hmm.
that's also a gift from God.
Right. Yeah, I wrote a poem about, my ability to walk is not my own. It's a gift. When I, if I ever do this, I talked with James, I think James of CM and Jackie's son, James, who wore the bacon. I think he is just getting his driver's license. And I told him, I said, if you'd like, I'd like to do a blessing of the driver's license party with you. He said, what's that all about? And I put this together as an assignment in seminary when I was in youth ministry class. What would you do? And we don't have rites of passage very much anymore. And so the driver's license is a big one. And the church isn't involved with it at all. So I thought, well, so I wanted to have a driver's license blessing and get a group of people together and have a party and then do some fun things. And one of the things I was going to do is, get a group of 12 or 14 people, however many, adults, all different ages, and with whatever youth are there with their driver's permits or licenses. And I said, okay, let's go around the room. Everybody tell about your close calls. And everybody's got close calls, or even worse. Tell about the accidents you've witnessed or been in, and everybody's got one. Boy, that's heady, but what an education. And then we talk about how many people in the world have the privilege of driving. It's still a minority. How many will have, how many cars have I had in my life, and how many cars will most people in the world? So it's a privilege. And what a good way to drive that home. So now you've got this privilege, and then we talk about somebody who's at the party what was it like when they took your driver's license away? Now you're getting perspective. And so I asked the students, I say, okay, what are your new freedoms? And they can enumerate them. What are your responsibilities? How are you going to use your gift of being able to drive to serve?
That was really a cool idea.
Well, no one ever takes me up on it. I don't know if James will or not. I would love to do that. I think it would be a fantastic thing.
I remember in driver's ed in high school, how the first day you went into driver's ed class, you watched the movie, and everybody talked about the movie when you go into that class. It showed wrecks, it showed everything, every dirty aspect of driving the car.
Yeah.
And it made you when you walked out, you were scared.
Exactly. Or at prom, they would park the wrecked car out on the high school lawn. So there is a usefulness to fear, but what better way instead at the church?
But I like how
you're in the church, you're not trying to scare them out of driving. You're trying to bless them and say, hey, this is your rite of passage. You're moving up. We want you to have this freedom. But know that this freedom comes as a gift, and it comes with responsibility, and you can bless others with it too. Don't forget. What a wonderful way to affirm it rather than, be scared. I don't know. I would love to be able to do that sometime. And from that time till now, no one's ever taken me up on doing that. So
Be a good driver,
yeah.
for sure. You can
So-
volunteer to be the designated driver,
Mhm.
take turns
We
doing
never had
that.
anybody
That is
that
so,
passes
yeah.
studies.
Oh, you didn't?
Never
Oh,
heard of
yeah.
it.
So in this parable, the walk away in Sunday school and VBS was always, it was about the person attaining the wealth. But today, my walk away is, there's so much more to it. Everything that we have is God's gift. The guy, we were just talking, he had all this food in there. I mean, it could be anything that you have excess of.
Mhm.
Why wasn't it shared so that his gift from God could be a pay it forward to other people who needed the crops to eat?
Yeah.
Would that have changed the parable and the outcome?
Sure.
Yeah.
That's why the parable, Ken says, is about justice, but it's also about insatiable desire. And we all are subject to this fear that we're not gonna have enough. And so we just got to keep getting more and more and more. And that's a human thing we can all relate to. And so if we allow that to be our perspective, then we dialogue with ourselves. Wait a minute, we're supposed to dialogue outside of ourselves. And we have a plumb line, if we forget. And I'm going to get a little political here. in our history in this country, I think it was Madison, and I don't know the exact quote, but talking about the form of government they were trying to embark upon, saying that this government is only for a religious people, or something along those lines. He says this won't work unless there's a greater consciousness. All right. I don't think he said Christian. He might have, but the idea is, if you don't have ethics and morality, then democracy, republic, capitalism, whatever, any system is going to be horrible. And that's what we're losing in our secularism in this country. I think our leaders, it's all proceeding from themselves. And there is no common good. There is no plumb line. And if you get a leader now who is a devout Christian, like the new Speaker of the House, that's now looked at with suspicion. Whatever you think of him, oh my gosh, he is, what kind of tyranny is he going to bring? Well, in the beginning, it wasn't supposed to be that. It was, I'm accountable not just to me or to my ideas of righteousness or to my party or to whatever. And so Madison said this, and it's not a democracy, it's a representative republic. Ben Franklin said, you have a republic if you can keep it. And we're losing it. And it's because we're all out for ourselves or our team, and we don't have God's common good in mind. And so nobody can give up power. No one can share. No one can store their excess in the mouths of the needy, because we need it, We have this insatiable desire for power, for wealth, for whatever, because we're going to run out and someday we're going to need it. So let's store it up. And we're destroying ourselves with it. So that's one of my takes on it. Forgive me if I'm getting too political with it. And what Ken said at the beginning, what insights. What did he say? The just division of land is the crux issue in the Middle East, and has been since the beginning.
And you say, you apologize for getting too political, but in essence, how can you have a biblical class without being political?
Right. So
Everything
please.
has been the forked tongue of religion and politics. It always has been, it always will.
So to the extent that I come off as trying to foist views upon you, don't go there. But if it causes you to think and we interact together and we try to come up with something that advances the common good. But so Ken said the just division of land. Well, what's been the issue in the Middle East that cannot be solved? And we, from our Western mindset, we make it worse. And I'm starting to learn that. In fact, it was not that long ago, a few months ago, after the October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel and 1,200 people were killed, and it was awful. And Bill Maher, of all people, had a time where he said, Palestinians, yeah, I get displacement, I get injustice, I get it. But look at the rest of the world. Look at our own country where Native peoples were displaced. Does that mean the war is supposed to go on forever? Or do you finally make the best of it where you are and move on? And then he would say that's true not only in the Middle East or in Europe, or everybody has had these situations where there has been an unjust taking of property, land, whatever. And he said, but other people seem to be able to get over it and move on. You Palestinians, you seem to want perpetual war. That resonates with the Western mind. All of us can say, yep, you dumb Palestinians, or whoever you want to call them. What we're not seeing is that the just division of land has been the cry since the beginning. So in the aftermath of the Holocaust, I'm getting way beyond my depth of smarts and wisdom here. But in the aftermath of the Holocaust, when everybody's appalled and said, oh, well, it would, as a payback to the Jews, let's establish this homeland for them. In the meantime, some people are going to be displaced, and that's, but in the Western mindset, we'll figure it out. After a time, it'll work itself out. In the Middle Eastern mindset,
No.
never.
World War I started that whole thing.
Yes,
But
so it
right
goes-
After, then England, the
Yeah.
United States, and a few others just started, well, we'll divvy this out here. And that without asking anybody, they just went and did it.
Yeah. So, yes, Jim.
Yeah, just based on what you said earlier, I don't know where they get the statistics, but on Fox News this morning, they said the United States is no longer in one of the top 25 places to live.
Who knows? And when
What
Ken,
criteria?
I'm sorry?
That's what I wanted.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah.
Statement, I can say what, there's no fact.
I mean, I grew up saying, that our system of government, for example, was terrible and horrible, but it's better than all the others.
Yeah,
And
I used to think that myself.
so I don't know. Ken Bailey, and forgive me, I told you I have a bunch to pontificate on here, but I got to speak with him in person with a group, and his take on September 11th, way different. And I don't know if this would have been a better direction, but gosh, I wish people like Ken were on the President's Advisory Council, people who know and love the Middle East. Wouldn't that be useful to have at least some advice at the table? Ken said that and he was in the Middle East, and my battery's going to run low here, so it looks like I'm going to lose Zoom, so I'm sorry about that. So God bless. And when I say the prayer at the close, I'll include you all. Ken said the sympathy for the United States throughout the Middle East and the world after September 11th was unprecedented. He said, had